Nice to be here. Yeah, it's to see you again. Okay. Yeah. Sí.
Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por su paciencia. Muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas. It is for the University of Chile an honor to have the presence of Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and our President, Rosa Devés. One of the greatest, both two of the greatest female leaders of our time. In this public university, an essential pillar of our vision is to develop and increase teaching, research, and outreach at the highest level, in accordance with national and international challenges. In 2005, under the guidance of our dear Professor Francisco Prieto, who unfortunately is no longer with us today, the Institute of International Study of the University of Chile started for the first time the regional trade policy courses of the WTO. Since then, a number of experts from the Secretary and specialists in trade policy have gathered together in this university. In 2011, we were honored to be appointed to the WTO Chairs Program Phase 1. Thanks to this, the Institute holds a prestigious master's degree in trade policy, several diplomas in different trade issues, the Latin America Trade Policy Journal, one of the few that publishes Spanish research in these topics, seminars amongst other projects. The collaboration with the WTO contributed to consolidate our prestigious faculty composed of distinguished and dynamic professors and professionals in this area. Since then, the university has continued to work with the Chairs Program, which has linked us closely to our region experts and beyond. As a result of this, we published in 2023 a book on trade policy and gender equality, edited by the WTO chairs in Mexico, Chile, and Barbados, which was forwarded by the Director General, in collaboration with Cambridge University. Also, the presence of our dear friends from the WTO chair in Costa Rica among us today is a testimony of this productive friendship. I would like to reiterate to the Director that we are sincerely grateful for the support that the WTO has given us, and that has allowed us to establish at the University of Chile as a reference in the field of trade policy. Without further, I must say that our dear Ambassador Sofía Boza is a distinguished professor of this university, and to whom I am sincerely grateful for this fireside. I love the fireside name of the conversation. This fireside conversation that we are about to listen to, which has been possible thanks to her generosity and affection for the university. Thank you very much, Director Okonjo-Iweala. I wish you all the success in your visit around South American countries celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Uruguay bond, and directing this multilateral trading system through the challenging current geopolitical scenario. Thanks to everybody, and let's listen to your nice conversation. Fireside conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor López, Director, for your very kind words and for hosting this fireside chat at the Institute of International Studies of the University of Chile. Director General, thank you for being here with us. As Professor Lopez already indicated, it is a great pleasure to have you with us today for this fireside chat, in which we are going to address some relevant issues for the WTO, multilateralism, and international trade. To start our conversation, Director General, in your opinion, why is the World Trade Organization so relevant for multilateralism?
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much, Sofía, and thanks to Professor Lopez, to the university president, and to all of you for being here this afternoon. Buenos dias.
It's okay.
It's okay. I should have practiced before. But it's very good to be here. So you asked why I think the multilateral trading system is still so important. Well, let me start with a fact that many people may not know. 75% of world trade today goes on under WTO terms, meaning the most favored nation terms that countries that are members of the WTO have agreed to accord to each other in terms of the type of tariffs they will apply to goods that are traded and the type of treatment they will give to each other in the trading environment. 75%. This ecosystem of the WTO assures that trade takes place in an orderly manner, in a fair, open, stable, and predictable environment. And many people do not know that. Can you imagine if there were no WTO and no rules of trade? It means that you're a business person, your goods are on the way, and they arrive, you don't know what tariff they are going to be charged. So you don't know the cost at which consumers will be buying your goods. Any country could charge any tariff they liked. It would be chaotic. So WTO makes sure that the multilateral trading system trade takes place in a very orderly fashion. So that is why it's so important. 75% of world trade goes on these terms. That's one. I think the second thing I'd like to say is people do not know the purpose of the WTO. And one of the things that attracted me to compete for the job is when I read the purpose as set out in the founding documents of the organization. It said that the purpose of the WTO is to enhance living standards, to help create employment, and to support sustainable development. This is all about people. So the WTO is there to make sure that trade helps to lift up the living standards of people, that it helps to create jobs, and that this is done in a way that makes the planet livable. So that's, I think, for now, what I'd like to say.
Thank you very much, Madam DG. You have mentioned very often the concept of reglobalization, Madam DG, in relation to the current situation of international economics. Could you explain to our audience today this concept further about reglobalization? What is that?
So many people have been talking of deglobalization because they feel that the era in which the world was becoming and trade was integrating the world more and more is over. And they're talking about deglobalization because they're dissatisfied with what they see as some of the impacts of global integration and of trade. But I just want to, before I get to reglobalization, I want to remind everyone of the positive impacts that the trading system and the rules that were created have had on the world. Since after World War II in 1945, the Bretton Woods institutions were created, the IMF, the World Bank, and WTO. It was supposed to be the International Trade Organization at that time. So 3 of them, except the US Congress didn't like the idea. They thought it would impinge on their sovereignty. So it didn't quite become ITO, it became GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Since that time, The idea was that a world that is interdependent will be more peaceful based on the experience of the great wars that had happened. And since that time, this system has worked, one, largely to help keep a peaceful world. Two, it has lifted more than 1.5 billion people out of extreme poverty. Just think about that. So it has helped to lift people out of poverty, enhance living standards, just as was envisaged. However, it is true that in doing that, there were poor regions in rich countries that were left behind. There were poor countries who were left behind. They were not as well integrated into the global trading system. And some of this led to the feeling that maybe trade is not delivering for everyone, particularly when in rich countries, labor began to feel that their jobs in manufacturing were being taken away by competition from other countries like China. And people began to feel, well, maybe this trade and this globalization doesn't work for me. But they forgot the big picture of just how much good it has done. But we have to admit, yes, there was some friction and some people were left behind. Now, this feeling intensified during the pandemic because we saw the vulnerability of supply chains. And that really made people feel that, wow, maybe I'm too vulnerable to the global trading system because goods did not arrive when they should have. Even medical supplies sometimes did not arrive. And people began to feel that being part of global supply chains may not be the right thing. But I want to just say one thing. We analyzed the situation at the WTO and we found that the problem is over-dependence on certain geographies for certain goods. Semiconductor chips, 95% manufactured in Chinese Taipei, in Taiwan. Pharmaceuticals, vaccines, 80% of vaccines exported from only 10 countries in the world. And that's why developing countries were left waiting in the queue. So we're over-dependent on certain geographies and in certain sectors, and that should not be. So when people started to talk about friendshoring and reshoring and trying to diversify supply chains, we said, that's good, but let's do it differently. If you want to diversify supply chains to build resilience, look at what the WTO is saying about something called reglobalization. Let us use this opportunity of diversification of supply chains to locate them in those geographies that were left behind. Why don't we diversify to more developing countries, to poor regions in rich countries that were not part of the first wave of integration? And that's what we are calling reglobalization. It's an opportunity to bring in those left at the margin. You kill two birds with one stone. You build global resilience, and at the same time, you're more inclusive. So I'll end this by saying, when people talk of diversification, they usually think about, let's diversify away from China. So China plus one, which is Vietnam or Indonesia. And we're saying, why not China plus Bangladesh? Why not China plus Morocco or South Africa or Chile or Costa Rica? And I could go on. There are places in the developing world that have the right business environment to receive diversified supply chains. And that's what we want them to do, and a business to look at, and that's what we're calling reglobalization.
Thank you very much, Mandy. One of the main issues in which WTO has had groundbreaking results in the past ministerial conferences has been fishery subsidies. As you know, fishing and ocean conservation are very relevant for Chile. What can you tell us, DG, about the fisheries agreement and the next steps involved?
Well, thank you, Sofía. First of all, why is it important to have an agreement to remove fisheries, some harmful fisheries subsidies? There are $22 billion of harmful fisheries subsidies that support illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing of our high seas, and they support overcapacity and overfishing of our oceans. And the world decided that we need sustainability. The United Nations asked the WTO to come up with an agreement. SDG 14.6 was given to the WTO to deliver an agreement that would do away with these harmful subsidies to stop illegal fishing and overfishing. Because 260 million people in the world depend on fisheries for their livelihood. We found that in 1970, about 10% of our oceans were overfished. Now, according to some statistics, it's anywhere from 38% if you look at the FAO to about 49, 50% if you look at the statistics from the Minderoo organization in Australia that does work on this. So can you imagine our oceans being almost 50% overfished? So we need to stop this because the livelihoods of many people depend on fisheries and exports. Some countries are quite dependent on the fisheries sector. So we decided to start negotiating an agreement at the WTO to do away with this $22 billion in harmful fisheries subsidies. But that started almost 2 decades ago. And it just wasn't being done. And the more you delay, the more the oceans become overfished. So what type of oceans are we leaving for our children to inherit? But when I arrived at the WTO, I found that this agreement had been in negotiations for 2 decades. And I said, we must get it done. So with the help of the members, we have to give them credit, including Chile. A lot of hard work was done. We were led by a very wonderful ambassador from Colombia. And he chaired the negotiations, and we were able at the ministerial conference, 12th ministerial conference in Geneva in 2022, to succeed in negotiating, agreeing on the first part of this fisheries subsidies to stop illegal and unregulated fishing of our high seas and to do away with some of these harmful subsidies. Then we have, and Chile has been one of the first countries to ratify this agreement. So we should give a clap to this country. For having been among the first to ratify. We now have 72 ratifications. We need 38 more for the agreement to come into effect, the first phase. And I'm very proud because it will, if we do it this year, as I'm pushing, it will be the fastest agreement to be ratified in WTO's history. Maybe done in two years plus instead of 4 or 5 years. Now there's a second phase to deal with overcapacity and overfishing. And that's what we're negotiating. We were supposed to close it at the 13th ministerial in Abu Dhabi 2 months ago, but we didn't quite get there. We still have work to do, and I hope we'll be able to complete this in Geneva this year. So let me just say something. Look, $22 billion in harmful fisheries subsidies. If we were to negotiate this away, you could repurpose those subsidies to do something good. We're looking for money for climate finance to fund developing countries to be able to make the transition to net zero by 2050. A just transition, they require the finance. Why are we putting money that is harmful for our fisheries? Why don't we redirect this and put it for climate finance? We have a loss and damage fund, and people gave 100 million and everybody was clapping and happy. When we need trillions for the transition. And here is 22 billion being used for the wrong thing. So I'm advocating that we stop this and send those subsidies for climate finance to developing countries.
Thank you very much, Mandy. We will try to do our best in Geneva to have this on. Madam De Gea, as you may know, Chile has recently launched its feminist foreign policy, which has as one of its pillars gender and trade. You have been championing women economic participation in trade. What do you think is relevant to increase women's participation in international trade? And which are some examples of the work at the WTO in this issue?
Well, I think that I champion women's participation everywhere because this is not even debatable. There have been so many empirical studies that show that when women have equal opportunity to men, it helps to increase overall global GDP and global welfare and national welfare and welfare at the family level. So there is no reason why women should be left behind. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the study by McKinsey that shows that if women had equal opportunity to participate in the global economy as men, we would have an additional $28 trillion added to the world economy. Can you see what we're missing? So it's trade is one area in which we need to do better. We've also found in our studies, and maybe Professor Lopez in your studies too, that women who export and 3 times more than those who sell domestically. So trade, being involved in trade is material to lifting income of women. So this is why we need to try to see how we can support women who are in external trade, who are exporting externally, because they obviously make more money than those trading inside. So just to give you a little bit of an idea why it's important to support women in trade. And we've done a lot of studies on this, but one of the things we need to do is to tackle some of the supply side constraints that these women face in trying to become part of either global supply chains, regional supply chains, or just export by themselves. And of course, they face some of the typical issues of lack of knowledge of markets and market access. Access to finance is always a problem. There's a $1.7 trillion gap for women's finance all over the world globally. They can't get access at the same rate as men. So we at the WTO, we are doing not just looking at the studies, we are also looking at agreements to see how can we, within the multilateral agreements we're making, ensure that women are treated. There's a gender dimension that makes sure women are not discriminated against or they are treated fairly. And I have to commend Chile because you've done a lot in this regard to support women. Through your trade agreements, I know that in almost all your FTAs, all your free trade agreements, there's a gender chapter. And so that is very commendable. We haven't gone as far in the multilateral agreements, but we got our first one in the Services Domestic Regulation Agreement, where there's a provision to ensure that women are not discriminated against in services. So one of the things we're doing at the WTO is seeing how can we make sure the gender dimension is well taken care of in multilateral trade agreements. But beyond that, you need some supply side interventions. And with that, we're working with our sister or our daughter organization, ITC. ITC, the International Trade Center, is 50% owned by WTO and 50% by UNCTAD. And they try to do a lot of direct supply side interventions to help women to deal with those issues of knowledge about international markets, market access issues, access to finance, etc., etc. So though we work hand in hand with the ITC, but recently, just to let you know, we floated a $50 million fund at a ministerial conference in Abu Dhabi 2 months ago to support women in digital trade. We've noticed that a lot of women are trading digitally and they're making more income from that because they cut out the middleman or middlewoman in many countries, but they need support. They can trade, but they can't scale. So we want to support them to scale, and we started this fund. And actually, Ms. Nicole Mensah, who is here, who is my gender advisor in my front office, She is the person in charge of this one. You can stand up so people can see you. Yeah. So we've we've had our first contribution by the UAE has given us $5 million, and we are going to go up to 50. And this will be for women, including in Chile. We'll be able to apply for support from this fund.
Thank you very much, Mandy. As well as women's participation in trade at the practical level in the field, you have been also advocating for gender balance at the technical and decision-making level. What do you think are the main challenges for female leaders, especially in international trade and economics?
Do you want to stay the whole night here? I've actually written a book on this, and I'm sorry I didn't bring a copy. I'm not trying to sell you the book, but it's called Women and Leadership, and I co-authored it with Julia Gillard, the former and only female Prime Minister of Australia. We're friends, and we decided to write this book together about the challenges for women in leadership. And the first thing we want to say, I just spoke to Madam President of the university. I will be happy when people stop saying, you're the first woman to do this and the first woman to do that. Being the first woman to be Director General of the WTO and the first African is nice, but it doesn't really make me that happy. What will make me happy is when people stop saying, you're the first woman to do X and Y, the first woman president of the University of Chile. That means that we've not succeeded yet. So the first thing that I have to tell you is that leadership, the gap for women is still very wide. And if you look at the statistics by the World Economic Forum or McKinsey, at the rate we're progressing in bringing women into top positions, it could take us another 100 years or so. So we have made gains, but we need to move faster. So the challenge is that sometimes men have to give way. You know, I love men. So I'm not trying to say anything, but they also have to be supporters of women. That's one of the things we found, that where you have men champions, male champions, it's not only women who can mentor other women into leadership. Men are very, very critical, because without them, the women will not have the opportunity to be able to make it to the top. So men cannot cop out of this and say they have not. They have a very important role to play as mentors and as those who create the opportunities for women to rise. What else? I think to be a woman in leadership, you have to be a risk taker. Women, our research found that women face not only glass, what we call a glass ceiling, but also a glass cliff. Have any of you ever heard of the glass cliff? You know, a cliff is when you're going over the edge. Women often get given positions when things are so bad that the men decide they don't want to do this. So if you talk to a lot of CEOs in companies, including top companies, some of the women leaders in politics, or even in international organizations, you will find that their opportunity came either when the organization was in some kind of crisis, or there were some problems that needed solving that were very tough, and nobody wanted the job. And then at that time, a woman was given access. And when that opportunity comes, it's called a glass cliff. Because if you don't succeed, you go over the edge. But if you succeed, you rescue the organization. And, you know, Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the ECB and was the former president of the IMF, the former managing director. She's one of the women we interviewed in our book. And her first opportunity to be a leader at a very big law firm. She was a lawyer by training, came when the law firm was in crisis. And they looked around for who was going to manage this situation, and none of the men were interested because it was a mess. So everybody nominated her. That's her story. And she was able to bring the organization out of the crisis and became the leader. I myself can tell you similar stories of glass cliffs. So that's one of the things, and I could go on, giving you examples of leadership. So can you avoid a glass cliff? Sometimes you have to be able to take the risk and believe in yourself and say, I am able to take this organization or this country or whatever it is out of this crisis. And then you work to do it. So you have to be a bit of a risk taker, because that may be the only opportunity you get to lead. When I ran for the WTO, there were 8 of us from 8 different countries who were nominated. But the interesting thing about it is that it was such a public competition. I remember we were being interviewed and people from all over the world were actually tuning in. I don't know how they got to know the link. Can you imagine being interviewed for a job in front of the world? If you don't get it, then everybody knows you failed. Not too many people are willing to take that kind of a risk. So you have to believe in yourself and be a bit of a risk taker if you want to be a leader as a woman.
Thank you very much, Madam DG. Well, a last question, because I know that you need to continue with your agenda, but DG, you have said often that the future of trade is services, green, and digital. Can you explain more to our audience about this?
You know, I think that there are very exciting developments in the field of trade. And I want the younger people to know this, because very often the perception of young people about the WTO is not a very favorable one, isn't it? How many of the young people here think the WTO is fantastic? Oh, you do? There's some. Okay. How many think it's not so fantastic? You're too shy to put up your hand. But generally, young people, because of the demonstrations in Seattle and in the past, have this image of trade and of the WTO as not so favorable. But I've explained to you why it's about people and how it's very exciting. Now, I think what is happening in the field of trade is very exciting. Just think about it. The world is going digital. And one of the most exciting developments in trade is services trade is growing, but digitally delivered services is the fastest growing segment of trade at 9% per year. So all the things that streaming of videos, accounting services, education, all the things that are delivered digitally across borders, that's trade. People are doing it, but they don't know they're trading. You're buying services online, and that's trade. And it's growing very fast. In Chile, it's growing at 11%. So Chile is one of the countries in this region that is actually doing well at digitally delivered services trade. So that's why I'm excited about it, because I think that's the future. And young people are the ones doing it, and women. And that is why we were floating a fund to support women. I think it's the future of trade. And services also, so that's one. The next is green. Climate change is an existential threat that we all have to deal with. And the sooner we realize we must try to get to net zero by 2050, the better. So the issue is, what instruments, how can trade be part of the solution? People often see trade as part of the problem because of the emissions from the logistics of trade. Now that's being dealt with. The aviation industry and shipping, they're all working at alternative fuels that can drive a less carbon intensive pathway. But within trade itself, are there policies that could help us get to net zero? And the answer is yes. I won't bore you by going into them, but that's what excites me when I say the future of trade is green. And you cannot decarbonize without trade, because you need trade to diffuse the technologies that are coming up and get them cheaper and at scale. And that's what's actually happening with solar and wind power. They are much less expensive now than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because of trade. Trade has been able to diffuse these technologies, taking them from where they're made to where they're needed and enlarging the scope so they can be cheaper. So that's why I say the future of trade is green. We have $1.7 trillion in green trade now. It's going to expand and become larger and larger. So we have to look in the trading environment, what are the rules that can underpin green trade, digital trade? And I'm proud that at the WTO, we're negotiating an e-commerce agreement to build the rules that can underpin digital trade. We are negotiating a fantastic agreement on investment facilitation for development, which is being led by Ambassador Sofía, who is working really hard. That will clear away the barriers to investment so that if you want to invest in green, it makes it easier for those who want to invest as well. So the WTO is gearing up to support all these areas, and that's why I'm excited. Now, the last thing is inclusion. I believe that trade must be inclusive. For all the reasons I've said to you before, we should look to make sure no one is left behind anymore. And trade must work for people who are marginalized and for countries that were not integrated into the global trading system, who are at the margins. So whatever we do, we must try to make trade green, digital, services, and inclusive.
Thank you very much, Mandy, for this so interesting conversation. As always, I have learned a lot from you, and I'm sure that also our audience. I ask all of you to give a round of applause to Madam Lee. Thank you very much to you all for joining us today. And before closing this ceremony, Director López telling me that we are going to listen to the anthem of the university. That's right?
Yeah, right. Okay, so we stand up. Thank you.